Chocolate Factory, Chapter 16, The Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas, everybody said at once. Oompa Loompas. Imported direct from Loombaland, said Mr. Wonka proudly. There's no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but Mr. Wonka, cried Mrs. Salt, I'm a teacher of geography. Then you will know all about it, said Mr. Wonka. And oh, what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested by the most dangerous beasts in the world. Hornswogglers and snozzwangers and those terrible wicked wangdoodles. A wangdoodle could eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for second helping. When I went out there, I found the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in tree houses to escape from the wangdoodles and the hornwoggers and the snozzwangers, and they were living in green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting, and the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing through the treetops, looking for other things to mash up, and with the caterpillars to make them taste even better, red beetles, for instance, and eucalyptus leaves, and the bark of Bing Bong Tree, all of them beastly, but not quite so beastly as the caterpillars. The poor little Oompa Loompas, the one food they longed for the most was the cocoa bean, but they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cocoa beans a year, and oh, how they craved them. They used to dream about cocoa beans all night and talk about them all day. You only had to mention the word cocoa to an Oompa Loompa, and he'd begin dribbling at the mouth. The cocoa bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cocoa tree, happened to be the thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cocoa bean, and the cocoa bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cocoa beans every year in this factory, and so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy about this particular food, I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mashed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompa-ish. Look here, if you and all your people will come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cocoa beans you want. I've got mountains of them in my storehouses. You can have cocoa beans for every meal. You can gorge yourself silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cocoa beans if you wish. You really mean it? Asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaping up from his chair. Of course I mean it, I said. You can have cold chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than cocoa beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. It's a deal, he cried. Come on, let's go. So I shipped all of them over here, every man, woman and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing boxes with holes in them, and when they got here safely, they were wonderful workers. They all speak English now, and they love dancing and music. They're always making up songs. I expect you'll hear a good deal of singing today from time to time, but I must warn you, though, they're rather mischievous. They're like their jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, wear only deer skins. The women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. The women use fresh leaves every day. Daddy, shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, sweetheart, I don't think you'd better do that." Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had silently sneaked away to the edge of the river. He was now kneeling on the riverbank, scooping hot, melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Chapter 17. When Mr. Wonka turned around and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please, I beg not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," cried out Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from that river at once." "This stuff is fabulous," said Augustus, taking not the slightest bit of notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Gosh, I wish I needed a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and wagging his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground, with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus," cried Mrs. Gloop, "you'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people across the country." "Be careful, Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning too far out." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek, then a splash, then into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him," cried Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown, he can't swim a yard. Save him, save him." "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop, "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up again to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Fish me out," he yelled. "Just don't stand there," Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something." "I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing that, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer towards the mouth of one of those great pipes that were dangling down into the river. Then all at once the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled from under the surface and into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes," somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first, like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back at once. Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look, he's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, he has stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe," yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once." The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, but they could not see was that building up behind him was a solid mass pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give, something did give, and that something was Augustus. Woof! Up he shot like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared," said Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go to? Quick, call the fire brigade." "Keep calm," said Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger." Augustus has gone up on a tiny little journey, that's all. The most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. You just wait and see. How can he possibly come out just fine, snapped Mrs. Gloop. He'd be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds. Impossible, said Mr. Wonka. Unthinkable. Inconceivable. Absurd. He would never get made into marshmallows. And why not, may I ask? Said Mrs. Gloop. Because that pipe doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one that Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make the most delicious kind of strawberry-flavoured chocolate-coated fudge. Then he'll be made into a strawberry-flavoured chocolate-coated fudge, screamed Mrs. Gloop. My poor Augustus, they'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning. Quite right, said Mr. Gloop. I know I'm right, said Mrs. Gloop. It's beyond a joke, said Mr. Gloop. Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so, said Mrs. Gloop. Look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh at that when my boy has gone up in the pipe? You monster, she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka, as though she was going to run him through. You think it's a joke, don't you? You think that sucking my boy up in your fudge room just like that is one great big colossal joke? He'll be perfectly fine, said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. He'll be chocolate fudge, screamed Mrs. Gloop. Never, said Mr. Wonka. Of course he will, screamed Mrs. Gloop. I wouldn't allow it, said Mr. Wonka. And why not? Shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Because the taste would be terrible, said Mr. Wonka. Just imagine it. Augustus-flavoured chocolate-coated Gloop. No one would buy it. They most certainly would, cried Mr. Gloop, indignantly. I don't want to think about it, screamed Mrs. Gloop. Nor do I, said Mr. Wonka. And I do promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe. If he's perfectly safe, then where is he? Snapped Mrs. Gloop, leaping to him this instant. Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharp. Click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared as from nowhere and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy white. His long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head just came above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin slung over his shoulder. Now listen to me, said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them to find their son, Augustus. He's just got up the pipe. The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gloop and exploded into peals of laughter. Oh, do be quiet, said Mr. Wonka. Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think this is at all funny. You can say that again, said Mrs. Gloop. Go straight to the fudge room, Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa, and when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain you'll find him in there, but you'd better look sharp. You'd have to hurry. You'd have to leave him in the chocolate mixing barrel for too long. He's liable to get poured out into the fudge boiler, and that will really be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would come out quite uneatable. Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. I'm joking, said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. I didn't mean it, forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop and Mr. Gloop. Goodbye, see you later. As Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing around and beating wildly upon a number of very small drums. Augustus Gloop, they chanted. Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop. Grandpa, cried Charlie. Listen to them. What are they doing? Shh, said Grandpa Joe. singing, said Mr. Wonka. Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word they said. It's all nonsense, every bit of it. Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa? Asked Charlie. Of course they're joking, answered Grandpa Joe. They must be joking. At least I hope they're joking. Don't you?